Hello crafters, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsSTM.com. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana episode. In this video, I'm showing how to create elegant Christmas cards that are easily mass-produced and easy to mail too. I'm working with a new stamp set from Simon called Glistening Snowflakes. This stamp set is filled with beautiful snowflake imagery, and we have snowflakes grouped forming various shapes. There's a tall triangle, that's a Christmas tree, and that's the shape that I'm using in my video. And there are also circles that can be turned into beautiful Christmas ornaments, and several hanging snowflakes too, as well as individual snowflakes in various sizes. If you want, you can get a coordinating die set to cut these images out, and I love that there is a die for every single snowflake in this set. It makes it very versatile, as you can use these snowflakes on many other projects. There are no sentiments in this set, so I brought in another set called Simple Holiday Greetings. And just like the name says, these are simple font sentiments, and they go really well with the complexity of the snowflakes and complement them nicely. I'm going to use the Christmas Blessings sentiment for my cards. My plan for these cards is to heat emboss the image in the center of dark-colored cardstock panel using metallic color embossing powder and darken the edges of the panel using an ink blending technique to bring the eye of the viewer to the center of the card and to the beautiful snowflakes. I have my Mini Misty stamping tool and a panel of dark green cardstock. I find this technique works best on dark colors of cardstock because that makes the image pop. I treated the paper with anti-static powder tool and next inked up the image with clear embossing and watermark ink. I stamped it once and then inked it again and stamped it once more to make sure I had a perfect impression. I covered it with antique gold embossing powder from Simon. I love this color of embossing powder and I come back to this color every time I create Christmas cards. Next, I warmed up my heat tool and heat set the powder to melt it. The key here is to keep the heat tool moving. Otherwise, if you keep it in one spot for too long, the paper might warp, affecting the look of the finished card. Mine warped a little bit. It is expected when you do this kind of technique, but I'll show you a trick on how to fix that later on in this video. Next, I gave the powder a few seconds to cool off. You want to make sure to do that, otherwise you might smear the hot powder on the paper, and I have done that many times because of my lack of patience. Once the powder is cool, and it takes about 5 seconds for it to cool off, I used my pencil eraser and removed the leftover anti-static powder on the panel. You could see that white milky residue there. We don't want it, we want to get rid of it. Now, it looks very classy and elegant as is, but we're going to take it up a notch. Here I have two ink pads, a darkest green that I have in my stash, this is Field from Simon, and also a black ink pad. What we need to do is we need to darken the edges of the panel. By doing that, we will lighten the center of the card, where the shape is embossed, without actually doing anything, and we will grab the attention this way. Now, this green ink is probably not dark enough, but I'm still going to use it to ink blend the edges. As I apply the ink using my Simons Stamp ink blending brush, you can see that it does add color to the edges of the panel. It looks darker because it is wetting the paper, and when the paper is wet, it does turn a shade darker. So I'm not sure if it is adding any color to the panel. In fact, I'm most certainly positive that it is not adding any color, but it is wetting the paper and it is preparing it for the next step, which is ink blending with the black ink. The black is what's really going to add color and darken those edges. We could have ink blended the black right away, but it might go on very dark and very harsh. So I like to add a transition color first and then add my black in small doses so that I do not overdo it. We can always add more color later, but we cannot take the color away. This has darkened the edges nicely, and we can see that the center of the card now looks lighter. Not too light, of course, but there is definite color variation between the edges and the center. Next, I want to add gold embossing powder around the edges to make this panel look as if it is dipped in gold paint. I love this technique. It always gives very beautiful and elegant results. Now our panel is wet. We just ink blended a lot of ink around the edges, so it is wet, and that wetness will allow for the embossing powder to grab onto the panel. But if you did not do the ink blending, you can use your embossing ink and sort of dip the panel into the embossing ink pad to get the edge of the panel wet. Here I have 2 embossing ink pads, a clean one, that's the one that I use for stamping, and then a dirty one, the one that I use for techniques like this. So just to show you what I mean, I'm going to slide the ink pad along the edges of the panel. I am pressing the panel lightly to make sure that I have a little bit of ink coming onto the front of the panel as well. Next, we can add our embossing powder, and there is a method to doing it. You don't want to pour the embossing powder onto the panel like you would with any other regular embossing, because our panel is wet and the embossing powder will stick to all of the wet areas. Remember, we just did a lot of ink blending, so a lot of this panel is still wet. Instead, add a little bit of powder onto a scrap paper like this. So just create like a little line with the embossing powder and then just dip the panel into the powder. Imagine you're dipping the panel into paint. And you can control how deep you want your paper to go into the powder, meaning how much or how little powder you want to get onto your panel. And you can also use a paintbrush and knock any excess embossing powder if you feel like you have too much here. So you really have a lot of control with this technique. Next, just use the heat tool and heat set the powder in place to create that beautiful gold dipped edge. Now, we did a ton of heat embossing here, and naturally the panel warped slightly. To fix that, I like to use scrap cardstock, glue the sheets together, and use that sort of as a flattening mechanism. I'm making an A2 card, so I have 4 panels of scrap cardstock that I trimmed just slightly smaller than my A2 card, and I'm going to glue them together. Once I do that, I use them to adhere the embossed panel onto the card base. The 4 layers of cardstock help flatten the panel. If your panel warped too much, this trick will not be able to help. But if you have a little bit of warping, this really does help to flatten the card. Now, I do make sure to add glue everywhere, but especially around the edges when adhering the 4 layers onto the embossed panel. I want to make sure that the edges are firmly adhered, and I press hard or I put a paperweight on top to let the glue dry and really grab onto each section of my panel. Lastly, I want to decorate my card with gems. I'm adding a white gem. This is OPAL gems from Spellbinders, and I'm adding a gem onto the center of each snowflake. And next, I'm using a white pen to color some sections of the snowflakes white. I really wanted to bring a little bit of white to this card because, well, snowflakes are white, and I wanted to have a little bit of that color present on this project. Now, this is an easy card to make. You can also vary the cardstock colors. You can vary the colors of embossing powder and have different variations of this design. This type of card is good for mass production as it doesn't take long to make and you don't have any coloring here, and it is all fairly simple yet very beautiful. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope you're going to give this card idea a try. If you make a card inspired by this video, we'd love it if you shared your project online and tagged us on social media. We always enjoy seeing what you make. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys, and I'll see you next time.
Hi there, I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at SimonsSaysStamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.